Hey everybody, it's Jack with Future Pastimes, and in this video I'm going to be talking about what is involved in designing content for the Dune board game. A lot of people recently have been asking me, how did I get into the position I am, where I am designing stuff for it, and what goes on in the design process. And all of this, I'm sure, is a way to try to get me to reveal stuff about what's going on with the Kwisatz Haderach campaign, which I'm not going to do, mostly because there's not a whole lot I can go into. I mean, there is more content which we were contracted to create for it, which they've teased out a little bit, that you can read on your own on the GameFound page, and I'll put a link in the description. And definitely go there and become a follower, because announcements are coming. They're going to start talking publicly about what is involved, and then I'll know too, and I'll have opinions about what it is that's going on. But in the meantime, we've had 3 other expansions, and so let me first talk about how did I even get into becoming a part of Future Pastimes. For those of you who don't know, the original designers, and that's Bill, Jack, and Peter, they also designed Cosmic Encounter, which they actually did before Dune, and some other games, but those are the 2 big games that they put out, Cosmic Encounter, then Dune. And Cosmic Encounter is my favorite game. I love Dune, but Cosmic Encounter I love a little bit more. And I created a website that cataloged everything about Cosmic Encounter and became a storage house for every variant that I could find, many of which were my own. And that was really the driving force, was I didn't want to bother other people who had websites with some variants listed to be like, here's 20 more variants. Why aren't you putting them on your website? I said, I'll just create my own. So I created a website called The Warp, and that was 30 years ago that I started that. And so I got on the radar of Future Pastimes through that. They like to engage with their fan base. And so we were talking about it. I became one of the users of Cosmic Encounter Online, the app that they had, which was a lot of fun. It was a good solo way to do it. It's a very pared down version of Cosmic. Didn't have all the bells and whistles that I typically like to play with, but it was a nice way to play Cosmic Encounter when you had nothing else going on, and you could play by yourself, which was another perk. And then when Fantasy Flight got the license and was putting out their own version, I became a consultant, sort of unofficially. Kevin Wilson knew about the Warp and knew that I was a Cosmic Encounter super fan, so he reached out to me, and I got to advise him on things and help him pick out aliens from other fans and evaluate designs that he had come up with and give my 2 cents on this and that, and contribute aliens and other content over the years and over the expansions, ultimately leading up to me being a part of the design team on their 5th expansion, and then designing stuff with the 6th and fully designing the 7th one. And so it was before then, it was around 2018, that Peter and Bill and Greg Alaka said, you're contributing quite a bit and keeping Cosmic Encounter alive, and we like all your ideas. You should join Future Pastimes. So I did, and it was a great opportunity for me. I've always dabbled in board game design, but here was an opportunity to actually get more stuff published. Now, they had already done the 2019 edition of Dune. They had just turned it in by the time I came on board, so I didn't really have anything to do with that, other than they asked me about a way to jazz up the Emperor's alliance ability. So just giving spice to their allies, it was okay. Nobody can do it better than the Emperor. And the fact that the Emperor can do it whenever they want is nice, but they wanted something a little bit more, so I suggested the paying for additional revivals as an idea. So that's really the only thing I contributed to that. But right after joining Future Pastimes was when we started contracting with Gale Force 9 to do expansions. Now, the plan originally was to start off with what they'd already designed. Now, they had done Spice Harvest and the Duel as 2 expansions in the Avalon Hill days, and they were keen to revisit those. They were open to the idea that they could be better. And yeah, they knew that Duel hadn't really gotten a very warm reception. Spice Harvest definitely more, but there was opportunity to modernize it a little bit. And but there was also a lot of talk about factions. So probably in those days there were a lot of fan ideas about doing faction additions. And at the top of the list were for the Ixians and the Tleilaxu. So we had a little powwow and we talked about, you know what, why don't we think about pushing off Spice Harvest and the Duel until later on, as maybe as a third. And that was what it was kind of pitched as. We would do that as maybe a third, or I think even early on it was like the second, like one of them would be the second, one would be the third. It really wasn't put down in ink. And I was already thinking ahead to, I think there's more than just not just two expansions, but two factions that we should be thinking about adding. And I was of the mindset that Spice Harvest involved these planet cards that you would have they're almost like your faction cards. But I thought it makes more sense to do factions first and then do Spice Harvest afterward, so that you're not having to then go, oh, we did Spice Harvest and now we came out with some factions and now here's some stuff for Spice Harvest. Seemed like it wasn't the most elegant approach. Although, now in retrospect, it's like, who cares? Yeah, throw in whatever component you need to say this only works for Spice Harvest and you'll need to get that if you want to use this component. So probably not that big a deal, but at least it gave me an excuse. I talked them into doing Chom and Richesse before we tackled Spice Harvest and whatever, because I had already thought about, doing Chom as another faction. And in the process of reading up on a lot of lore to get good names for leaders for the Ixians and the Tleilaxu, we learned about there's a lot of Richesse characters, and they got a big subplot in some of these prequel books that take place relatively close to the timeline of Dune itself. And so there's other faction, potential that's out there. So on the first expansion, they brought Jack Kittredge back in. He's not technically part of Future Pastimes anymore, but he still cares and he has ideas and wants to be involved. And so that one was, the five of us working on that expansion and kicking around a lot of ideas. And so for coming up with how we were going to design it, I looked at all of the other fan ideas that were out there, because I think if there is a good idea out there, it probably should be the one that gets published. It doesn't matter if it's coming from us. We've done that with Cosmic Encounter. A lot of fan ideas have made their way into publication. The reward deck was something that I designed back in the Mayfair days and just put on my website. And it was something that Kevin Wilson thought was a good idea. So that's the philosophy that we were adopting as well. But none of us really liked any of those ideas. We especially didn't like the ones that were in the general for the Ixians and the Tleilaxu. They just were really hard to understand, and they were not very fun. So we played around with it, and then we looked at two things. And this has been a staple of how we design. One is we were looking at something interesting to be able to do in the game that factions normally can't do. And that is something that also was born out of Cosmic Encounter. Playing so many games of Cosmic Encounter, and you find yourself in a situation where you wish you could do X and you can't, and then suddenly a new alien was born. And so that works for Dune as well, and it's not necessarily a whole faction, but one advantage. You're like, oh, I wish we could do this. For the Tleilaxu, it was fairly obvious that they were going to get that income that anybody spends on on revivals of any kind. But just paying for revivals and getting leaders was not really enough. And you weren't going to be getting anything until midway in the game. And usually people with dead leaders and a lot of forces in the tanks don't have a lot of spice either. So that's why we added in the income for free revival that comes from the spice bank itself. There's always a little bit of spice for the Tleilaxu to get in there. So being able to do something that nobody is doing is one thing. And the other was just, what is the lore? So the Dune lore is very interesting. It's very expansive. There's a lot of really interesting and novel things that go on. And it's looking for ways to how can we address this lore into something that is gameplay. And that is a lot of what drove the Ixian faction. And so, and I think out of all of the factions that we've done, the Ixians is the one that we have played the most fast and loose with what it does. So there was a character who was a cyborg, and that was Prince Romber, who is on the shield. So he's not even a character that you really are playing with in the game. But this concept of cyborgs and how the Ixians might have cyborgs. I mean, it's really they don't really have any other cyborgs, but it's an interesting concept. So the idea of some double strength troops that you could have in there in a number higher than what the Fremen have and higher than what the Emperor has, but pairing it with half strength troops, because suboids were something that they did have in some of those stories, and that they came across as these sickly, weirdos that probably were not up to being in a battle. And so that was an interesting design exercise in coming up with how to combine those two things, get the right numbers of how many of the 20 forces should be cyborg, how many should be suboids, should it even be 20 forces? And we settled on yes, for consistency's sake, pretty early on. And then the hidden mobile stronghold, again, was originally driven by lore. It was the idea that they had a secret base on Arrakis. It definitely wasn't mobile per se, but the idea of a stronghold that could move was a very interesting idea, and I think it may have been something that Bill came up with, but I'm not 100% sure. Peter thought it might be interesting for it be something that's floating around, and then the storm moves it because the storm's constantly moving. But one, that was a little bit weird. Two, it was even further divorced from the lore than they just being mobile, period. And three, in practice, it wasn't that useful. And it was better to give the Ixians control over moving it. And so, again, I've mentioned this before, but the idea of it's mobile, it does not mean that it is a giant Roomba that moves around on the desert, and when it sees spice, it sucks it up. It's more like a MASH unit. So if you ever watched the show MASH, the M in MASH stands for mobile, and while they think there was maybe only one episode where they moved the MASH unit, that was the point, was that they could pack everything up and then move it somewhere else and then set it up again. So that's what the HMS was meant to do. And so those were kind of the design choices with that. With CHOAM, it was looking at, all right, this is supposed to be a really wealthy organization like OPEC that is manipulating the economy. And, again, it was driven by the idea of being something that would have an income, a regular income. It was probably smart to tie it to CHOAM charity in some way. And that evolved over time. And Peter was the one who suggested that all of the so-called worthless cards, they're all products in some way, maybe not all of them, but they could be tied to something that is itself tied to the economy, and therefore CHOAM finds nothing to be totally worthless. Everything has its use, and so giving a unique effect, I thought was a really fun idea, and it's probably my favorite part of CHOAM. And I think a lot of people are like, well, CHOAM is just, utterly boring. And I was like, well, the Emperor is also kind of boring when you look at it. I mean, the Sardaukar are kind of sexy, but then they only have two things that they can do. And CHOAM has a couple of them, and granted, not necessarily that exciting, but I would say, lore-wise, they prefer to keep a low profile and not remind people that they're just so involved in everything and so filthy rich. So I think I like that, and offsetting it with what we were doing with Richesse. Richesse was very lore-driven. And the idea that they were struggling economically was what really drove, half of what they do, in that they are selling things to get some income. And then the other half was the fact that some Richessian, or Richesian, however you want to say it, scientists had developed the no-field technology. So, in the story, the scientist who does develop it is killed, and spoiler alert, and other scientists are trying to reverse engineer it and figure it out, and they're spending the whole time trying to do it. And they essentially kind of run out of time. But a lot of what we do with Dune is a big what if. And so the idea that, okay, maybe these guys did get it figured out in time, and now they're employing this technology. And so I really enjoy what the no fields do. And so that was what was going on. And then we got to, all right, it's spice harvest time. We got to dig in. And but again, over the course of the time, I had been reading, more and more of these books. I'd read Paul of Dune, which takes place, between Dune and Dune Messiah, but also has all these flashbacks to stuff happening when he was a younger boy. And that was where the whole Ikaz and Moritani storyline came in, which I found to be the most interesting part of all four of those books. And I was like, I think these are two really good factions that could add some interesting things to Dune. And it was, again, a nice mix of lore and game effect. So for the Ikaz, the game effect was, I wanted to have a faction that could be in a territory with their ally. And what would that mean, and how could you best leverage it? And then over the course of playtesting, the ambassador element developed. And that was actually even suggested by playtesters. They started off with, using Nexus cards, whereas if you weren't even playing with them, they got to use them, and it was fun, but there were certainly some areas where it didn't quite work out. And so the ambassadors, I think, is a much better and more interesting. And then at the same time, the terror tokens was the one idea that we had with Moritani from the start. And, the only thing that really evolved there was how many should there be, and what, how awful are they going to be? And more as we were playtesting it, I felt like the factions were developing into mirrors of each other, with sort of a good side, bad side, with Ikaz on the good side and Moritani clearly on the bad side. And so it informed some of the other design, the sharing of Duke Vidal, the idea of placing tokens that can be triggered, the way to get into an alliance outside of a nexus. So the Ikaz can get into an alliance with their Ikaz ambassador, even on the first round of the game, which is really the only way you can kind of do that. And then, of course, Moritani, with their very insidious use of enemy of my enemy, can get into an alliance, even having one or both of the players that they were in an alliance with, getting out of the alliance. So, and so that kind of was what drove us to push Spice Harvest and Duel off more. So, now Gale Force 9 has already talked about how Spice Harvest is part of the GameFound campaign. It's part of a fourth expansion that includes a lot of other stuff, which I can't really go into. And I'm not really going to go into Spice Harvest that much, other than to say that it does take into account the 12 factions that we have, not just the first 6. And it is building on what was good about Spice Harvest, and then really enhancing what was a little bit lacking. And so there's a lot more depth that's going to be involved in that. And I think even like different modes of how you're going to employ it, which will make more sense later on. I haven't talked about the duel, and all I'm going to say is that we didn't ignore it, but it's definitely, it'll be, you'll hardly recognize it for one thing, and that's all I'm going to say. So the process, yeah, a lot of it is driven by playtesting, and I've always been a huge proponent that things need to be playtested thoroughly with as many different people, especially people that have different play styles. And that is something that we learned over the course of me playing Dune with the original designers. Now, a lot of you will know that when you're thinking about basic and advanced, that wasn't how it was originally doled out in the Avalon Hill days. It was just the rules, and then there were some optional rules. And the Future Pastimes guys back then, the 3 of them, they did not design those optional rules. They are not super familiar with them. They can't really answer a lot of questions about them. And if you go back, for the 40 years since that stuff came out, you can find references to people asking future pastimes, especially Jack Kittredge, who did a lot of Q&A with people, writing letters and early email use. There's some inconsistent answers, and there's some stuff that people are like, yes, this is how it's done, and other people are like, that doesn't make any sense, though. Have you read the rules? And so it's been kind of a weird situation. And so they didn't ever play with bribery. They didn't really use deal making in their games. Of course, they weren't using advanced combat or like spice styling or double spice blows or the extra advantages that much. They quickly would pick up on it, and then I would refresh them on how spice styling works every time we would play test the advanced advantages for each of the factions that we were designing for those different expansions. But it was important that we also reach out to other players, especially those who are familiar with the advanced play, and that includes people who cut their teeth on the Avalon Hill version, and as well as those who only know the 2019 Gale Force 9 edition. And so that exposure, I think, really helped us to whip things into shape. Obviously, there wasn't 100% consensus on anything, and quite a number of playtesters showed up just to see what it was, and then they disappeared and have never been seen or heard from again. I hope they're doing well. But there's been a core group that has been around for the past several expansions, and so their opinions are very valid to me, and building that rapport, but also bringing in new players, because you always are like, oh, we do it this way, or we interpreted it that way, and that really helps us to try to refine how we're writing the rules and looking for ways to be consistent. So that brings me to, all right, is there going to be a new rule book in the campaign for the Kwisatz Haderach edition? I would hope so, and I think that the plan would be to revisit a lot of things so that wording is more consistent and intent is much more clear, and some level of rebalancing or other clarifications or whatnot, I think, are inevitable. So brace yourself for that sort of thing. In my research and kind of going back and looking at how people have been playing the game, what the original rules were, what the original design intent was, consulting with the original designers, talking to people like Brad Johnson, who's been heavily involved in the WBC tournament, and a lot of what they kind of developed over the years found its way into that 2019 edition, but not everything. And so revisiting that and saying, or what drove these decisions or these changes or these house rules, and what out of that should be revisited and looked at and considered moving forward. So it's an exciting time, and I definitely wanted to touch on that while I also talked a little bit about the whole design process. Since 2019, we've been using Tabletop Simulator just because we're geographically all over the place, Georgia and Massachusetts and Maine, and I'm in Virginia. So we needed a way to be able to play test, and that made sense for us. So even pre-COVID, we were employing TTS as a good way to quickly bring things into a session so that we could play test, and then using Photoshop and whatever to update the assets periodically to say, yeah, this should be a 3 instead of a 2, or whatever the case may be. So that process is huge, and I think it's a great tool for anybody who is a wannabe designer or likes to create custom stuff. That's been my passion for many, many, many years. And most of these games you see here, I've created custom components for. And we're living in a pretty good time where you can get stuff pretty professionally printed or made that can fold its way pretty seamlessly into your existing game. That's been my experience anyway. So I like that. And I know that other people have been doing that with Dune. I've recently been reviewing a lot of these homebrew factions, and I think there's some really exciting ideas. And so I'd love to see some of those make their way. Maybe down the line, Gale Force 9 will be interested in yet another expansion. And certainly if you want to see more factions or more things like these variants that you see on Etsy, then yeah, let Gale Force 9 know. The campaign on GameFound is a good way to do it. There's a lot of comments, some heated debate, but certainly weigh in if you have an opinion one way or the other. And then, yeah, as soon as we get to the point where they're publicly disclosing content and whatnot, I'll definitely have more to say. And if you have topics for a video that you want to see, definitely let me know in the comments. And I will try to make time to get to those. More Power Alliances were definitely coming because somebody was kind enough to send me a list of every alliance pairing that I have not yet done. And I think just about every pair can make a good alliance. So I will get more into that, and certainly anything non-Dune that interests you as well. Let me know in the comments. That's it for this one, everybody. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.